She became one of the most iconic figures in fashion, known around the world for the Birkin bag, a symbol of luxury and wealth. Yet behind that legacy was a woman who lived a life full of pain, heartache, and personal sacrifice. The woman who inspired one of the world's most coveted fashion items also lived through a series of tragedies, including the loss of her beloved daughter and the toxic, yet passionate relationship with Serge Gainsbourg. This is the untold story of Jane Birkin, a woman who paid a high price for fame, love, and artistic genius. Jane Mallory Birkin was born in London on December 14, 1946. Her father, David Birkin, was a Royal Navy commander, and her mother, Judy Campbell, was a well-known stage actress. That combination already hints at the duality that would define so much of Jane's life. Discipline on one side, bohemia on the other. Structure and performance, order and imagination. She did not emerge from nowhere. She came from a family where culture mattered, where the stage was not a distant dream, but part of the air around her. Even so, her early image was not that of a destiny-driven prodigy marching toward greatness. She was not introduced to the world as a monumental talent in waiting. She entered public life with a much lighter, less stable identity. A very young woman from swinging London, beautiful, slim, slightly androgynous, carrying the style of the 1960s on her body, before people knew what her deeper career would become. That matters because Jane Birkin's first fame was visual before it was fully artistic. She appeared at the exact historical moment when image had become its own language. London in the 1960s was exporting youth, fashion, irreverence, and sexual freedom to the rest of the world. Birkin fit that moment perfectly. According to the BFI obituary, she initially made an impression as a long-legged, mini-skirted, almost Twiggy-like embodiment of Carnaby street chic. In other words, before France turned her into a chanson icon, and before Hermès turned her surname into luxury mythology, Jane Birkin was already being read by the world through silhouette, attitude, and style. Her earliest public meaning was written on the surface. That would become both her opportunity and her trap. She first took to the stage at 17, and one of her early key jobs was in the 1965 musical Passion Flower Hotel, scored by John Barry, the composer whose music was already strongly associated with the James Bond films. That production did more than put her in front of an audience. It changed the course of her life, because from that work came not just professional exposure, but marriage. For Jane Birkin, the line between performance and private life blurred almost immediately. The stage was not merely a place of work. It became the place where life itself kept turning. Jane married John Barry while she was still extremely young. Reuters notes that she married shortly after appearing in Passion Flower Hotel, and The Guardian obituary places the marriage in 1965. When she was 19, their daughter Kate was born in 1967. This phase of Birkin's life is important because it complicates the later public image of her as a perpetual gamine, a forever young muse drifting through Paris in basket bags and men's shirts. In reality, she was a mother very early. She was navigating adulthood, marriage, and public visibility at an age when many future stars are still being discovered. Before she became part of French cultural mythology, she had already lived through a marriage and the birth of a child. The marriage to Barry did not last. By 1968, they were divorced. The public story that would later define Jane Birkin often begins with Serge Gainsbourg, as if everything before him were just a prelude. But that is too simple. The first major fracture in her adult life happened before France fully claimed her. She had already experienced the collapse of a marriage before she was 22. She had already become responsible not only for herself, but for a daughter. And that early break matters because it gives the later Jane Birkin story a different emotional contour. She did not arrive in Paris as an untouched ingenue. She arrived as a young woman who had already lived through enough change to understand that glamour and stability were not the same thing. Kate would remain one of the central presences in her life. And the story of Jane Birkin cannot be told honestly without keeping Kate in view from the beginning. Because when people later described Jane through fashion, romance, scandal, or style, there was always also the quieter fact of family. Birkin had 3 daughters over the course of her life: Kate Barry, Charlotte Gainsbourg, and Lou Doylin, and that family line became part of her public identity too. The later tragedies of that family give the earlier years a different weight when we look back. What seemed like a bright beginning contains, in hindsight, the first threads of a story that would be marked by both reinvention and grief. Before she crossed the Channel and remade herself in France, Jane Birkin had already become visible through cinema. One of the earliest major landmarks in her public profile was Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up, 1966. Reuters describes the film as controversial, and notes Birkin's appearance in a nude threesome scene. Britannica similarly identifies Blow Up as one of the places where she first appeared in the public eye. In a career that would later become associated with daring, ambiguity, and boundary-pushing material, Blow Up was an early signal. It placed Birkin inside one of the defining cinematic works of the decade, and it tied her name to a film that was not merely popular, but culturally disruptive. This is one of the ironies of Jane Birkin's life. The public often remembered her as fragile, airy, almost weightless. But the work that first made people notice her was often charged, adult, and provocative. She was not introduced through harmless innocence. She was introduced in part through transgression. That pattern would repeat. Again and again, the public would project softness onto her image while the work itself pushed against social comfort. She was often treated as an embodiment of ease, yet the art around her was full of unease. Erotic, moral, emotional, or political. That tension is one reason Birkin stayed fascinating. Her face seemed to promise one thing. The work often delivered something more complicated. And yet, for all the prestige of Blow Up, Birkin's real transformation would not happen in England. It would happen in France. The London chapter gave her visibility, but Paris would give her legend. What London offered was the first outline. A young actress, a look, a spark, a certain kind of modernity. Paris would take those raw elements and turn them into something harder to separate from myth. The move across the Channel did not just change her career. It changed the language in which the world would understand her. According to both Reuters and the BFI, Birkin arrived in Paris in 1969 to appear in the film Slogan. The movie itself is not what history remembers most. The real event was the meeting that happened on its set: Jane Birkin and Serge Gainsbourg. By then Gainsbourg was already a major figure in French culture, a songwriter, provocateur, and public personality with a reputation for brilliance and scandal. Birkin, by contrast, came in carrying London youthfulness, a striking face, and a foreign accent that would become part of her appeal in France. The pairing was immediate and combustible. The BFI describes the relationship as one that propelled them into iconic celebrity coupledom. Reuters notes that in France she shot to fame not only through her work, but through that very love affair. To understand why this meeting mattered so much, it helps to remember how France received her. Birkin was English, young, slim, informal, and visibly unlike the standard image of classic French stardom. She brought a different energy. The accent remained. The looseness remained. The sense that she was slightly outside the system remained. That foreignness did not weaken her hold on France. It became part of it. Reuters describes her as the most Parisian of the English. A phrase that captures the paradox at the core of her identity. She was never fully absorbed into Frenchness by losing herself. She became beloved partly because she never entirely ceased to sound or feel English. But the Gainsbourg relationship also had a cost built into it from the start. He was nearly 20 years older, already established, already mythologized. She was younger, newly arrived, and easy for the culture to frame as muse rather than equal. The BFI obituary is especially sharp on this point. Her beauty, accent, and muse status quickly became defining features of her public identity. That framing brought visibility, but it also threatened to freeze her in place. Once a culture decides what role you serve in someone else's story, it can take decades to reclaim your own. For Birkin, Paris was both the making of her and the beginning of the shadow she would spend much of her life stepping out from under. In 1969, Birkin and Gainsbourg released the duet that would follow her forever, Je t'aime moi non plus. Reuters notes that the song was sexually explicit, banned by the BBC, and condemned by the Vatican. The Guardian obituary adds that it became one of the defining works attached to her name. Official charts records that it topped the UK chart in 1969 despite being banned, and ranks it at the top of its list of foreign language singles to reach number 1. That alone tells you how unusual the record was. It was not just provocative. It was commercially unstoppable. It scandalized and succeeded at the same time. The song turned Birkin into a global symbol almost overnight, but the symbol was dangerously narrow. She became, in the public imagination, the sighing young Englishwoman in one infamous duet. The record's notoriety did what notorious art often does. It simplified the people inside it. Gainsbourg became the genius provocateur. Birkin became the breathy voice. That reduction would cling to her for decades. The Guardian obituary noted that Birkin herself understood this. She knew the song would overshadow almost everything else, even though her career eventually expanded far beyond it. That is one of the saddest paradoxes in her story. A song that gave her immense fame also trapped her inside a role that many people never updated. And yet it would be a mistake to describe the song only as a prison. It was also a door. It made her impossible to ignore. It inserted her into music history. It tied her voice to one of the most scandalous and successful songs of the era. It also demonstrated something important about Birkin that would become clearer later. She could transform material written for her by men into something unmistakably her own. BFI notes that Birkin made the song her own, even if doing so was a mixed blessing. That phrase captures the reality very well.
Je t'aime, moi non plus gave Jane Birkin immortality.
But it gave it to her in a form she had to spend years complicating. Birkin and Gainsbourg stayed together through most of the 1970s and had a daughter, Charlotte Gainsbourg, born in 1971. Their partnership became one of the most famous cultural pairings in France. It combined sex, art, scandal, tenderness, provocation, and performance. Everything about it was media-ready. The age gap, the beauty contrast, the voice contrast, the visual contrast between his disheveled severity and her slim, seemingly effortless softness. France did not merely observe the relationship. It absorbed it into its own mythology. But there is a difference between public myth and private durability. By later accounts, the relationship was turbulent, and Reuters explicitly says Gainsbourg's drinking eventually destroyed it. The Guardian's memoir-related coverage similarly describes it as turbulent. Even after the romance ended around 1980 to 81, however, the connection did not disappear. Birkin remained linked to Gainsbourg artistically and culturally. He continued writing for her after the breakup. She continued performing his songs for the rest of her life. They remained close until his death in 1991. This is one reason her story feels unusually difficult to narrate cleanly. There is no simple before and after. Even leaving Serge did not mean leaving the Serge era behind. The fixation on their relationship also created a long-term interpretive problem for Birkin. It made it hard for many people to see her without seeing him. BFI points out that her association with Gainsbourg fixed certain traits in the public imagination: beauty, accent, muse status. The Guardian years later noted that even decades after their separation, her name was still rarely mentioned without being bracketed with his. That is a revealing kind of fame. It means the relationship was so culturally productive that it generated its own permanent gravity. Birkin's challenge was not merely to survive a breakup. It was to continue producing meaningful work in a culture that often preferred the old love story to the later woman. Birkin and Gainsbourg stayed together through most of the 1970s and had a daughter, Charlotte Gainsbourg, born in 1971. Their partnership became one of the most famous cultural pairings in France. It combined sex, art, scandal, tenderness, provocation, and performance. Everything about it was media-ready. The age gap, the beauty contrast, the voice contrast, the visual contrast between his disheveled severity and her slim, seemingly effortless softness. France did not merely observe the relationship. It absorbed it into its own mythology. But there is a difference between public myth and private durability. By later accounts, the relationship was turbulent, and Reuters explicitly says Gainsbourg's drinking eventually destroyed it. The Guardian's memoir-related coverage similarly describes it as turbulent. Even after the romance ended around 1980 to 81, however, the connection did not disappear. Birkin remained linked to Gainsbourg artistically and culturally. He continued writing for her after the breakup. She continued performing his songs for the rest of her life. They remained close until his death in 1991. This is one reason her story feels unusually difficult to narrate cleanly. There is no simple before and after. Even leaving Serge did not mean leaving the Serge era behind. The fixation on their relationship also created a long-term interpretive problem for Birkin. It made it hard for many people to see her without seeing him. BFI points out that her association with Gainsbourg fixed certain traits in the public imagination: beauty, accent, muse status. The Guardian years later noted that even decades after their separation, her name was still rarely mentioned without being bracketed with his. That is a revealing kind of fame. It means the relationship was so culturally productive that it generated its own permanent gravity. Birkin's challenge was not merely to survive a breakup. It was to continue producing meaningful work in a culture that often preferred the old love story to the later woman. When Birkin left Gainsbourg around 1980 to 81, the separation did not read like an ending in the ordinary sense. Reuters reports that she then went on living with director Jacques Doillon, with whom she had another daughter, Lou Doillon, born in 1982. The BFI notes that Birkin also began appearing in Doillon's films. So the next phase of her life was not simply retreat. It was another reinvention, personal and artistic at once. She was still a mother, still an actress, still musically linked to Gainsbourg, and now entering a new domestic and creative partnership. That ability to keep moving is one of the most underappreciated features of her career. Jane Birkin is often described as a symbol, but symbols are static. Birkin was not static. She kept changing mediums, contexts, and tones. She could appear in intimate dramas, then on stage, then in recordings that revisited Gainsbourg's writing from a different emotional distance. BFI notes that her music career outlived her partnership with him, while still paying tribute to it. That is a subtle and difficult achievement. Many artists spend years trying either to sever themselves from an old collaboration, or to live off it unchanged. Birkin did neither. She continued engaging with Gainsbourg's repertoire, but as a mature artist with her own interpretive authority. Even so, the emotional complexity never fully vanished. The public never quite allowed it to. Paris kept their mythology alive. The song stayed in circulation. The house on Rue de Verneuil remained part of the legend. The love story had ended, but the cultural fixation had not. Birkin lived with that in a way that now seems almost emblematic of late 20th century celebrity. Once the world has made a permanent image out of your relationship, the relationship can end while the image never does. Jane Birkin's later work becomes much more moving when understood against that fact. She was not just performing songs or acting in films. She was steadily repossessing her life from the stories other people preferred to tell about it. Because Je t'aime moi non plus was so dominant in the public imagination, it is easy to forget that Birkin had a substantial recording life beyond that single. Reuters points to albums like Baby Alone and Babylone in 1983 and Amour de Faints in 1990, both built from Gainsbourg's words and music. BFI emphasizes that she later toured with her own repertoire and remained a compelling live performer. Remembered for appearing in jeans and a t-shirt or sweater, turning intimacy into stage presence. She was not the kind of singer who overwhelmed with sheer vocal force. Her power came from something different: fragility, texture, conversational closeness, and emotional specificity. The voice that once scandalized people for sounding too intimate later became a vehicle for maturity, melancholy, wit, and survival. That matters because it corrects one of the laziest ways people remember her. Jane Birkin was often treated as a woman who happened to sing rather than as a singer with a distinct artistic identity. But over time she made that identity impossible to dismiss. Reuters notes that she wrote her own album Arabesque in 2002, and that singer Etienne Daho produced and composed her last album in 2020. Those late career facts show continuity. She did not simply become a heritage act replaying one youth-defining scandal. She remained active over decades, collaborating, recording, and appearing on stage. Her career extended far beyond the era that first made her famous. Her live reputation is especially significant. BFI's remembrance of seeing her at London's Roundhouse in 2008 stresses her warm naturalness. That phrase gets close to what made Birkin so durable. In an age of overproduced iconography, she often seemed disarmingly human. Even when she was already a legend, she could still project informality. That is probably why audiences stayed with her. The myth was huge, but the person still felt accessible. She never seemed to stand behind the aura with complete comfort. Instead, she let that discomfort become part of the performance. It made the late Jane Birkin not smaller than the icon, but more believable than it. At some point, the story of Jane Birkin crossed from art into consumer mythology. According to Britannica, the origin story of the Birkin bag begins with a chance encounter between Birkin and Jean-Louis Dumas of Hermès on a flight from Paris to London in the early 1980s. Birkin, known for carrying a wicker basket, spilled her belongings, and the conversation turned to the absence of a fashionable bag, suited to the needs of a mother. She sketched an idea on an airplane sick bag. Hermès released the resulting design in 1984 with her blessing to use her name. Britannica also notes that the bag later became a status symbol, especially from the 1990s onward. Reuters, in its obituary, recounts the same broad story. Dumas saw her struggling with her straw bag on a flight to London, and the encounter inspired the now famous design. There is something almost too perfect about this story. The woman known for seeming unpretentious, practical, spontaneous, and stylish without trying becomes the namesake of one of the least casual objects in fashion history. A bag associated with exclusivity and enormous cost comes from a conversation about functionality, motherhood, and spilled belongings. The gap between origin and later meaning is huge. That gap is part of why the Birkin bag remains such a potent cultural symbol. It was born from use and inconvenience, but evolved into an object of ritualized desire. Jane Birkin, in a way, was turned into luxury by a world that first loved her for seeming the opposite of calculated luxury. And yet the bag also had the effect of freezing her image for global audiences who may never have heard an album or seen a film. For many people outside France, Jane Birkin meant handbag first, person second. That is a strange fate for any artist. To inspire a product that eclipses the public memory of your actual work is a form of immortality, but also a distortion. Britannica explicitly notes that the Birkin became a status symbol known for scarcity and price. That is one kind of legacy. But it sits oddly beside the other one. The actress of Varda and Rivette, the singer of delicate live shows, the activist seen at protests. The mother who endured enormous private grief. The bag made her name universal. It did not tell the whole truth about the life attached to it. One of the most valuable things about looking back on Jane Birkin now is that the distance allows us to see more than the era saw in real time. BFI describes her as someone who grew from late 1960s pop icon into an artist in her own right, and a French national treasure. Reuters adds that in France she was beloved not only for songs and films, but also for her warmth, and for her consistent advocacy of women's and LGBT rights. BFI expands that political profile, noting her campaigning for abortion rights, against the far right, and against French government policy on undocumented migrants. In other words, Birkin's public life cannot be reduced to aesthetics. She used her visibility in civic ways too. This is where the simplistic image of Birkin as merely pretty becomes inadequate. Beauty opened doors for her and she knew that. Style helped make her unforgettable. And history will never separate her from it. But over time, she accumulated a different kind of authority. Not the authority of spectacle, but of moral and cultural presence. In France especially, she became something deeper than a retro icon. She became familiar, enduring, public in a way that meant not just famous but woven into national cultural memory. Reuters' obituary makes clear that French tributes at the time of her death treated her as far more than a relic of 1960s cool. She had become, in the eyes of many, part of the emotional furniture of modern French culture. That kind of status is not automatic. Plenty of glamorous figures fade once their era passes. Birkin did not. The reason is that she kept adding to herself. She did not remain where fame first placed her. She turned from image into body of work, then from body of work into public conscience, then from public conscience into something close to cultural kinship. She became one of those rare performers whom a country claims not only for what they made, but for how they lived among its people over time. That is why her death felt, for France, like more than celebrity news. It felt like the passing of a familiar voice in the national atmosphere. No account of Jane Birkin's later life can avoid the immense tragedy of Kate Barry's death. Kate, her eldest daughter from her marriage to John Barry, died in 2013 after falling from her fourth-floor Paris apartment. Reuters notes the date of her death in Birkin's family history, while contemporaneous reporting from The Guardian recorded the circumstances of the fall. However one chooses to frame the uncertainties around that event, the loss itself is not uncertain. It was catastrophic. Birkin's public story had always included her daughters, but Kate's death changed the emotional light in which the whole life is viewed. From that point on, any description of Jane Birkin as simply stylish, airy, or bohemian became insufficient. A mother had lost a child. This is the point in the story where glamour simply stops being an adequate language. The Birkin bag, the songs, the fashion photography, the youth legend, the great directors, the famous love affair, all of it suddenly sits beside a fact that dwarfs symbolic readings. Birkin herself did continue working after 2013, but grief enters the narrative permanently at this point. Even when the public conversation remained focused on legacy and style, the human reality had shifted. You cannot understand the quiet fragility of Birkin's last decade without putting Kate at the center of it. There is something especially painful about the placement of this tragedy in the arc of her life. By then Birkin had already survived reinventions, love affairs, separations, career transitions, and decades of public projection. She had turned into one of those figures who seemed to have outlived the chaos of youth, and arrived at a wiser, quieter stature. Then the worst kind of loss entered the story anyway. It reminds us that the neat narrative celebrities are often assigned, rise, scandal, reinvention, legacy, are false comforts. Real life does not arrange itself for elegance. Jane Birkin's later years carry that truth in every line. On July 16, 2023, Jane Birkin was found dead at her home in Paris. She was 76. Reuters reported that local media said she had been found at home, and that the French Culture Ministry described her as a timeless francophone icon. The funeral followed on July 24, 2023, when, according to Reuters, hundreds of fans joined family members and film legends in Paris to say goodbye. That public farewell says a great deal. Birkin did not die as a nostalgic footnote. She died as a figure still deeply held in public affection. The tributes that followed her death were striking in their tone. They were not only about beauty, style, or scandal, though those elements were always part of her legend. They were also about warmth, familiarity, and belonging. Reuters noted that Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo described her as the most Parisian of the English. President Emmanuel Macron called her a French icon. These reactions mattered because they confirmed the long arc of Birkin's life. She had arrived in France as a young outsider. She died as someone the country claimed as one of its own cultural treasures. And maybe that is the most moving transformation in the whole story. Not the bag. Not even the song. But the migration of identity itself. Jane Birkin began as a London-born actress with a look that belonged to the 1960s. She became, over decades, a French cultural figure whose death created a national sense of loss. Very few artists cross a border so completely without ever fully erasing where they came from. Birkin's Englishness never vanished. It became part of the charm, part of the voice, part of the myth. But France turned that foreignness into intimacy. That is why her ending in Paris feels narratively right, even if emotionally sad. She died where her second life had taken deepest root. So what is Jane Birkin's true legacy? The easiest answer is the handbag, because the handbag is visible everywhere. The second easiest is the song, because the song has scandal, chart history, and mythology attached to it. Both answers are real. The Birkin bag did become a global status symbol after its 1984 debut. And Je t'aime moi non plus remains one of the most famous provocative duets in pop history. But neither is enough on its own. Jane Birkin's real legacy lies in the distance between those simplifications and the fuller truth of her life. She left behind an example of artistic persistence after typecasting. She left behind performances in films by important European directors. She left behind a recording life that continued well past the moment of youthful scandal. She left behind daughters who themselves became major artistic figures. She left behind a model of public life in which glamour did not prevent civic commitment. And she left behind one of the most unusual celebrity trajectories of the late 20th century. An Englishwoman who became a French national treasure without ever ceasing to be herself. There is also a harder legacy, one that cannot be merchandised or mythologized so easily. Jane Birkin's life shows how often culture confuses image with identity. She was photographed into eternity, styled into eternity, named into eternity. Yet again and again, the facts of her life exceeded the picture. She was not just the girl beside Serge. Not just the voice in the band song. Not just the face behind the bag. Not just the muse. She was the artist who survived being called a muse. She was the mother who endured unbearable loss. She was the public figure who aged without disowning vulnerability. She was the woman who kept working after the mythology was already secure. That is the deeper story. And perhaps that is why Jane Birkin still matters. Because she speaks to a modern condition. What happens when the world knows your image better than your life? What happens when fame is built on a version of you that is true, but incomplete? Some stars vanish inside that gap. Birkin spent decades widening it until the fuller self could breathe. She never fully escaped the legend. Nobody that famous ever does. But she kept adding layers until the legend was no longer all there was. By the time she died in 2023, Jane Birkin was not simply a relic of chic or controversy. She was evidence that a person can outgrow the story that first made them famous, even if the world never completely stops telling it. Jane Birkin came into the world as Jane Mallory Birkin, daughter of Judy Campbell and David Birkin. A girl from London who entered the 1960s spotlight almost before adulthood had properly begun. She moved through marriage, motherhood, controversy, cinema, music, international fame, activism, grief, illness and reinvention. She inspired a bag that became an empire of desire. She sang a duet that scandalized continents. She worked with some of the most important filmmakers in Europe. She loved, left, endured, protested, performed, and carried on. Then she died in Paris, the city that turned her from a young English starlet into something much stranger and more lasting. A figure claimed by history from more than one angle at once.